All right, folks, let's get started with chapter 18. Here we go. Here are the four sections, and we'll start with section 1 right here. And here's the focus question. In the Progressive Era, the economy grew enormously as industrial production increased, the population boomed, and the consumer marketplace expanded. For the last time, farms and cities grew together, and agriculture entered its golden age, with growing cities demanding more agricultural goods. Farm families poured into the western Great Plains. Between 1900 and 1910, the combined population of Texas and Oklahoma increased by nearly 2 million people. The Dakotas, Kansas, and Nebraska added 800,000. Major areas of commercial farming erupted in Arizona and California due to irrigation. But the city was the focus of progressive politics in the new mass consumer society, and the number of cities in the U.S. with a population of more than 100,000 grew. New York was the largest with 4.7 million people. The inequalities of urban life apparent in the 1890s persisted, with immigrants living in slums and the very wealthy living in isolated neighborhoods and luxurious mansions. J.P. Morgan's financial firm directly or indirectly controlled 40% of all financial and industrial capital in the nation, while more than a third of mining and factory workers lived in poverty. The cities attracted writers and artists who captured its dynamism and modernity. Others saw cities as places where corporate greed eroded traditional American values. A new generation of journalists writing for mass circulation national magazines exposed the problems of industrial and urban existence. Lincoln Steffen's series for McClure's magazine, published as The Shame of the Cities, showed how party bosses and businessmen profited from political corruption. In the same magazine, Ida Tarbell pointed to the arrogance and economic machinations of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. Theodore Roosevelt criticized this kind of journalism, calling it muckraking, or the use of journalistic skills to expose the underside of American life. Novelists produced similarly critical works of fiction, such as The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, whose descriptions of unsanitary slaughterhouses and rotten meat led directly to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug and Meat Inspection Acts of 1906. Most characteristic of early 20th century cities was the presence of immigrants. The new immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe reached its peak in the Progressive Era. Between 1901 and 1914, about 13 million immigrants came to the U.S., mostly from Italy, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This wave of immigration was part of a global process of immigration caused by industrial growth and agricultural decline. Between 1840 and 1914, when World War I halted migration from Europe, nearly 40 million people emigrated to the U.S., and another 20 million moved to other parts of the Western Hemisphere, including Canada, Argentina, Brazil, and the Caribbean. While many of these immigrants, pushed and pulled by a variety of factors, moved to America freely, not all emigrated as free labor. Large numbers of Chinese, Mexican, and Italian migrants were bound to long-term labor contracts signed with labor agents who provided the contract workers to American employers. Most European immigrants to America entered through Ellis Island in New York Harbor, which became the main facility for processing immigrants. Those who failed the medical examination or were judged to be anarchists, prostitutes, or otherwise undesirable were sent home. Millions of Americans today can trace their ancestry to Ellis Island immigrants. At the same time, Asian and Mexican migrants came to the American West, mostly through San Francisco and El Paso, Texas. Many ended up growing citrus crops in the San Gabriel Valley of California. By 1910, 1 of every 7 people in America was foreign-born, the highest percentage in American history. More than 40% of New York's population was born abroad, as was more than 30% in other major cities like Chicago and Milwaukee. Many immigrants moved west, most of them settling in industrial centers. By 1910, nearly 3/5 of the workers in the 20 leading manufacturing and mining industries were foreign-born. The new immigrants imagined America as a land of freedom, where everyone enjoyed equality before the law, worshipped as they pleased, found economic opportunity, and were emancipated from their homeland's oppressive social hierarchies. Agents sent abroad by the American government attempted to discover why such large-scale immigration was occurring. The main impetus was a desire to attain freedom and to engage in economic activities to eradicate their hopeless poverty. While some, such as Jews fleeing religious persecution in Russia, intended to settle permanently, most planned to earn money to return home and buy land. Groups such as the Irish and Mexicans had many such birds of passage who stayed only briefly in the United States. The new wave of immigrants settled mostly in close knit ethnic neighborhoods with their own businesses and community organizations and continued to speak their own language and published foreign language newspapers and other publications. Churches were central in these communities. Although most immigrants earned more in the United States than they could have at home, they faced long hours, low wages, and dangerous working conditions in the mines, factories, and fields. My people are not in America, remarked one Slavic priest. They are under it. Cities were also the birthplace of a mass consumption society that gave new meaning to American freedom. The promise of American life had always in part resided on the enjoyment of goods that in other nations were available only to the wealthy. Only in the Progressive era, however, did large downtown department stores, chain stores in cities, and retail mail order houses for rural residents make accessible the goods produced in American factories. Some of these goods included electric sewing machines, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and record players. Though low wages, unequal income distribution, and Southern poverty limited the extent of the consumer economy before World War II, in the Progressive era, mass consumption became a cornerstone of American freedom, understood as the abundance of goods offered by modern capitalism. Leisure activities also were part of mass consumption, with mass entertainment in amusement parks, dance halls, and theaters attracting large crowds. The most popular form of mass entertainment was vaudeville, a live theatrical entertainment consisting of numerous short acts. In this period, motion pictures also became a mass phenomenon, in which even working class moviegoers attended their Nickelodeons, so named because of their 5-cent ticket price. Traditional gender roles also changed dramatically as women were newly visible in public places such as workplaces, stores, and sites of entertainment. More and more women worked for wages, and although black and immigrant women were still confined to low paid, low skilled jobs, native born white women found expanding opportunities in white collar work. Women workers were no longer only young unmarried white women and adult black women. In 1920, of 8 million women working for wages, a quarter of them were married and living with their husbands. Working women became symbols of female emancipation, showing economic independence from men and moving beyond their traditional roles as wives and mothers. Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote Women in Economics to demonstrate that women were seeking lifelong careers and would find their freedom through the workplace. In the home, Gilman argued that women found oppression as a servant to her husband and children. Prevailing gender norms made them incapable of contributing to society or enjoying freedom. Their desire to participate in the new mass consumer society caused many women, both native and immigrant, to earn money independently of their families. This sometimes caused great friction, especially in immigrant families who sought to maintain their cultural practices under constant threat of new American ways of life. Fewer individuals were more wrapped up in the new consumer society than Henry Ford. Ford did not invent the automobile, but he created production and marketing techniques that brought it within the reach of ordinary Americans. In 1905, he founded the Ford Motor Company, only one of many small automobile manufacturers at the time. In 1908, he introduced the Model T, a simple and light vehicle sturdy enough to navigate the country's poor roads. Ford focused on standardizing output and lowering prices in order to bring a luxury good to the masses of consumers. Ford focused on standardizing output and lowering prices rather than catering to an elite marking like some European competitors. In 1913, Ford's Highland Park, Michigan factory adopted the moving assembly line, in which car frames were brought to workers on a continuously moving conveyor belt. This process allowed Ford to vastly reduce the time it took to produce an automobile, and thus greatly expand his output. In 1914, Ford raised his wages to an unheard of $5 per day, allowing him to attract skilled workers. But assembly line work was monotonous, and Ford used spies and armed detectives to prevent his employees from unionizing. Ford justified the high wages by arguing that workers needed to be able to afford the goods being produced by America's factories. By 1916, Ford's Model Ts were affordable for many workers. The economic system based on mass production and mass consumption came to be called Fordism. As production shifted from capital goods like steel and railroad equipment to consumer products, a new advertising industry perfected ways to increase sales, often by linking goods with the idea of freedom. Many products used liberty as a brand name or used images of liberty as a sales device. Edward Filene, a department store magnate, called consumerism a school of freedom, as consumers made individual choices on basic questions of living. Abundance came to define the American way of life, in which personal fulfillment was attained through acquiring material goods. But if abundance's promise shifted the search for freedom to the private life, it inspired political activism, as those excluded from mass consumption demanded inclusion. The desire for consumer goods led many workers to join unions and demand higher wages, and the claim that monopolistic corporations artificially raised prices at the expense of consumers became a weapon against the trusts. The consumer economy gave rise to ideas, a living wage and an American standard of living that offered a new language for criticizing inequalities of wealth and power. In his book, A Living Wage, Father John A. Ryan suggested that a decent standard of living was a natural and absolute right of citizenship. Ryan attempted to translate into American terms Pope Leo XIII's Declaration of 1894, Rerum Novarum, which endorsed social justice over competitive and individualistic competition. Demands for a living wage and a decent standard of living were part of the promise of the progressive era, in which some, like Simon W. Patton, predicted that want and scarcity were disappearing, with capitalism providing abundance and leisure for all. So that's the end of our first section. We'll be back for the next one.